Well, Politico has an interesting story, which is kind of difficult to decipher, but I'm going to try my best about Biden's supposed executive orders that he might issue regarding gun control. Now, of course, under the Constitution, very clear, it says shall not be infringed. Despite that, Congress, has passed laws that have restricted the Second Amendment, and as we know, also under the Constitution, laws have to be made by Congress and not by the president. Uh, Nevertheless, the executive branch has felt that it is within their purview to make up new gun laws in the form of executive orders. Trump did this, well, I guess he didn't directly sign an executive order, but the executive branch decided under Trump, let's just get rid of bump stocks for no reason. Just, hey, we don't like them anymore, so boo, they're banned. No new law was passed. There was no debate in Congress. The ATF just said, phooey, you lose. And anyone who has a bump stock, you're now a felon. And so Biden is trying to say, well, gee, getting gun control through Congress is going to be difficult, as you might imagine. There's a 50-50 Senate. And there are Democrats in vulnerable districts in vulnerable states who cannot afford to vote the party line on something so divisive. As I've made clear in the past, there's no debate left over guns. You're not going to convince people one way or the other. Nobody's wishy-washy on that. Either you hate guns or you believe in the right to bear arms. It's that simple. It's the most polarized issue in the country by far. There's no middle ground on that anymore, thankfully. I'm glad about that because, it's the people in the middle who you really have to worry about, not the extremists on either side. Just think about it. It's the same is true in Washington. The worst politicians are the so-called moderates who know how to work with both sides, the John McCains of the world. Those are the people in history who inflict the most amount of death and destruction. Now, according to Politico, what Biden is considering is restricting the sales of ghost guns. Now, what does that mean? I had to really think about when I was reading this. What they said is that people who buy ghost guns will now have to undergo a background check. And I thought to myself, so what's he talking about? Is he talking about gun registration? Because normally when they say background checks, because we already have background checks, they mean gun registration. But since he's only talking about ghost guns, supposedly, which are, what they're talking about are 80% lowers or 80% Glock frames, people who have made guns out of that. Now, I don't know what, this could mean multiple things. This could mean that 80% lowers are no longer considered 80%. They're now considered, actual receivers, and you have to go through an FFL to purchase an 80% lower, in which case there would be no purpose of having an 80% lower, and people would just buy completed lowers. Or what he could mean is that to transfer a completed gun that was built from an 80% lower that has no serial number, you have to go through an FFL, which to me, that sounds like he's saying you have to register ghost guns. Because they're not talking about a whole registry for everything. Because again, when they talk about universal background checks, the reason why that means a gun registry is because you already have background checks, but you don't have to, if you just, a gun, once you've purchased it, it's just a piece of property. You can give it to people if you want. You can give it to your brother to go on a hunting trip with or something like that. Or you can say to somebody, hey, give me $400 and you can have this gun. Because it's your property. You do with it what you want. It doesn't have a title on it. Like a deed to a house or something that you have to go through the government to transfer. But the idea of universal background checks essentially means that the government would, in practice, be issuing titles to guns that you would have to go through the government, probably, to transfer from one person to another, so the government knows exactly who owns which guns and where they live and blah, blah, blah. The purpose of which being not to stop criminals, of course, because criminals could just obtain guns illegally, like they always do. The purpose is so that later on down the road, when the government wants to confiscate guns, they know whose house to bust the door down of. So back to the proposed executive order, and these are from leaks, so we have zero details on it. And keep in mind that the people writing these stories don't necessarily understand anything about guns, so they're not going to be good at, if they hear this leak, they're not going to be, it's like a game of telephone, they're not going to translate it properly and necessarily word it right. So what I'm guessing here is that in practice, what this means is that they're going to no longer, they're going to change the standard on 80% receivers. So that what now qualifies as an 80% receiver, which in practical, in a practical sense, if you buy an 80% receiver, you can finish it yourself. That's the appeal of it. And then you have a part that you yourself manufactured, and so you don't have to go through any sort of FFL official dealership, do any background check, stuff like that. You can, because you're building it yourself, and there's nothing, there's no law against building a gun yourself. That's always been the case. You always had people who made their own weapons going back to the mists of history. And so the way that 80% lowers were born is that I forget who it was exactly, but there was the first manufacturer. I guess it was 80% arms or something. I think they had 80% in their name. The ATF told them, hey, you can, in order for a receiver to be considered, to be a completed receiver that has to be registered with the ATF, serial number wise, when you manufacture it as the manufacturer, that point is when it's 80% complete. And so these guys essentially took a lower, and they didn't totally finish it, and they took it to the ATF, and they said, okay, is this less than 80% complete? And the ATF said, yeah, that seems less than 80% complete. And then so since then, that's been the standard. Everyone sells a lower that looks exactly like that. The pocket for the fire control group, for example, it's not milled out. And I think there's some other details that are missing from it. But it's not totally a raw forging either. And now ARs aren't the only thing. There is also Glock frames that are 80% that you can get. I think 80% 1911s, too, some companies might make. And so in lieu of some sweeping gun ban, which is not going to happen, and if it did happen, would trigger a significant backlash, it looks like the Biden ATF is just going to go after 80% stuff. Now, hopefully, what they don't do is what the Trump administration did, which is a retroactive ban. And they say, not only are these no longer legal, they were never legal to begin with. And so if you're in possession of a bump stock, you're a felon. And so if the Biden administration says, if you're in possession of a lower that was built from an 80% lower, essentially everyone who was ever the customer of any of these 80% lower manufacturers, you're now a criminal and you have to turn in. And the ATF could just go to those people who manufacture 80% lowers and say, hey, we need a list of every single one of your customers ever, and we're going to go take their guns. That probably would be a step too far for the ATF, because the kind of people who buy 80% lowers tend to be a little more on the libertarian spectrum anyway. They tend to be people who are worried about the government being able to find them and their guns and stuff. That's why they take the extra precaution of doing an 80% lower. It's not because they're felons. I don't know. There's no case ever reported of a felon going through the trouble to try and manufacture a gun from an 80% receiver and then put it all together themselves just to commit a crime. The guys who do this want privacy, is what it's about. And so if they go try and break down their doors and take away their stuff, that's going to cause some problems for the ATF. You're going to have a lot of Ruby Ridge situations. And so I suspect they will not go that far. Now, the gun grabbers are probably going to be very disappointed by this, because this is not much in terms of the overall gun industry. If they take out 80% lowers, that leaves everything else. And I'd imagine most of you listening to this probably didn't even know what an 80% lower was. But it's still not constitutional of them to do that anyway. I mean, it's not constitutional of the ATF to do what they do, or of the federal government to force people to get background checks for 100% lowers or receivers or whatever. The Constitution says shall not be infringed. It's that simple. So everything about that is an infringement. They're already infringing on it, so they're just going to infringe a little more. So I don't expect a ton of backlash from this. Again, just like the bump stock ban, shouldn't happen. Not great. But the thing is, they're not, in a way, this is a smarter play for gun control than what the Democrats want to pass. which is, just a retread of the 1992 Clinton gun ban plus gun registration, because all that stuff those are things people have heard over and over again. That'll just enrage people. That is just partisan rage bait. It's not going to go anywhere. It'd be totally unenforceable. This, however, might be enforceable because they're targeting a minority, a small group of people, much smaller group of people than gun owners overall, or people who own quote-unquote assault weapons or quote high-capacity magazines. If they went after that stuff, it'd be game on, and there'd be too much resistance. But with something like this, they can push. Although it is definitely something that would raise the temperature. And so it would, it'd start to bring the pot up to a boil before the, the final countdown until, any real serious gun control. But who knows? Maybe the Biden administration is already recognizes that their gun control bill in Congress, might not even pass Congress, and so they're going to try and go for something like this as and make a big deal about it as a stopgap, or as some sort of hey, gun grabbers, we're sorry we weren't able to fulfill our campaign promises. Here's something. Sacrificial lamb, that was the term I was looking for. So I think that about covers what we know so far. I'll do an update on this if anything comes of it. I assume it will. And on gun control in general, I'm gonna that's one of the major topics that I'm gonna be following here, because again, I'll reiterate, if they went hard on gun control, that would be one of those like America-ending level decisions. It would completely shatter what's left of the Union. Because thankfully, I think that there is enough of a strong sentiment at the state level to nullify such laws. And if Biden tried anything too egregious by executive action, that would be even more easily nullified, because people would just not recognize, a presidential edict as law. So with that said, I guess I'll leave it there for today.